Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoy it. If so, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We hope you have a great time browsing. Hi, everyone. First-time poster here. And honestly, I never thought I'd be sharing this, but life has a way of blindsiding you. I'm James, a 38-year-old pilot. My wife, Emily, is 32. We've been together for nearly a decade, and for a while everything seemed perfect, or so I thought. We met on a snowy night at Denver International Airport, of all places. She was a passenger stranded due to a blizzard, and I was a young co-pilot, off-duty, waiting out the storm. She was sitting by herself at the gate, clutching a paperback novel and looking every bit like a lost protagonist in a rom-com. Naturally, I struck up a conversation. What started as a simple offer to grab coffee turned into a 6-hour chat about everything: travel, ambitions, childhood dreams, you name it. By the time flights resumed, I knew I wanted to see her again. It wasn't easy at first. My career was taking off, literally and figuratively, and Emily had a demanding job as a graphic designer. Long-distance relationships are hard, but we made it work. Between endless flights, sleepless nights, and time zones that felt like walls, we held on. And after 3 years of navigating life together, I proposed to her during a layover in Paris. I'll never forget it. An impromptu midnight stroll by the Seine, me with a pocket ring and trembling hands, and Emily laughing through tears as she said yes. We settled into a cozy home in Denver, where she thrived in her career, and I juggled my flights and time at home. For a while, we were that couple, always smiling, traveling, and making memories. But then, cracks began to form. In the past year or two, Emily started pulling away. At first, I thought it was just stress. Her work deadlines were brutal, and I was often away for days at a time. She'd brush off my concerns with excuses like, "I'm just tired," or "You wouldn't get it. You're not here enough to understand." But something felt off. She became more guarded with her phone, always flipping it face down or taking calls in another room. The spark in her eyes that used to light up when I came home from a trip was gone. She started spending more weekends out with friends, and when I'd ask about it, her answers were vague and dismissive. I chalked it up to the toll of my career on our marriage. Pilots are gone so much. It's a running joke in the industry that we're married to the sky. Maybe I had neglected her needs. Maybe I wasn't doing enough. But one thing kept gnawing at me. Every time I had an extended flight schedule, her mood would inexplicably brighten. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I'd leave on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, her texts would be shorter, her tone lighter. When I'd get back, it was like the air had shifted. She'd be distant, almost indifferent. It didn't add up. I tried to push those thoughts away. I love Emily, and I wanted to believe she'd never hurt me. But deep down, I felt the beginnings of a storm brewing, one that would change everything. The nagging feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. As much as I tried to brush it off, pretending things were fine, the small signs started stacking up like a checklist for disaster. Emily wasn't just distant, she was evasive. She started scheduling more girls' nights and weekend brunches, always conveniently timed when my flights were the longest. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, but then the excuses started getting ridiculous. One Saturday, I was unexpectedly grounded due to a canceled flight. I called Emily to let her know I'd be home earlier than planned, and her reaction threw me off. Instead of being excited, she sounded caught off guard. "Oh," she stammered, that's great. But I'm actually at Rebecca's house for a spa day. I'll probably be home late." Rebecca, her best friend, lived 2 blocks away, yet Emily didn't offer for me to stop by. And when I casually texted Rebecca later to thank her for keeping Emily company, Rebecca replied with a puzzled, "Haven't seen her in weeks. Everything okay?" That was the first real crack in her story. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started paying more attention. I kept track of her whereabouts when I was gone, cross-referencing her excuses with things that didn't quite add up. The patterns were almost laughable. Every time I had an overnight flight, she suddenly had a project deadline or a friend's event that conveniently left her out late. Then came the night that solidified my suspicions. I was scheduled to fly from Denver to Seattle and back, a short hop that usually had me home by 10 p.m. But mid-flight, we were diverted to Portland due to a mechanical issue, grounding us for the night. I called Emily to let her know. No answer. I texted her. No reply. I finally got through around midnight. She sounded groggy and annoyed. "Why are you calling so late?" she asked. "I told you we were diverted," I said. "I wanted to check in." "Oh," she said quickly, her tone shifting. "Sorry, I must have fallen asleep. Long day at work." But something felt off. The static of movement in the background, the odd echo, like she wasn't at home. When I got back the next morning, I noticed little things. The trash can in the kitchen had an empty wine bottle I hadn't opened, paired with 2 glasses. Her story about having a quiet night at home unraveled with every glance. I decided to stop playing blind. The next week, before I left for a 3-day flight, I installed a small motion-activated camera in our living room. I know it sounds extreme, but I had to know. My gut was screaming that something was wrong, and I needed proof. When I returned, my stomach was in knots as I reviewed the footage. The first day, nothing out of the ordinary. Emily came home, ate dinner, watched TV. The second day, same routine until about 9 p.m. A man showed up at our house. I didn't recognize him at first. Tall, dark hair, confident stride. He waltzed into my home like he owned the place. Emily greeted him at the door with a kiss that was anything but platonic. My world froze. They sat on the couch, drinking wine and laughing. At one point, she leaned into him, whispering something that made him grin. I couldn't watch anymore. I shut the footage off, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. The betrayal hit me like turbulence out of nowhere. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the casualness of it all. The way she laughed with him, like she hadn't made vows to me, like I didn't exist. But I didn't act on it. Not yet. I needed more answers before I confronted her. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? And how could she smile at me every time I came home, knowing she was doing this? The storm wasn't brewing anymore. It had arrived. After seeing that footage, my mind raced. Who was this guy? How long had this been going on? Was this the first time? Or had I been clueless for years? I couldn't shake the image of Emily kissing him at the door. The warmth in her smile was a knife in my gut. That was the smile she used to give me when I'd come home after a long trip. Now it belonged to someone else. But I wasn't about to confront her empty-handed. I needed to know everything. So I dug deeper. I started by checking her phone records. Pilots may spend a lot of time in the sky, but we know how to read logs and spot patterns. Sure enough, there were dozens of calls and texts to a number I didn't recognize. The timing lined up perfectly with the nights I was away. I reverse searched the number. His name was Mark. No last name, just a basic listing. But it was enough to start connecting the dots. I remembered that Emily had mentioned a Mark before, a guy from her office who worked in marketing. She'd casually brought him up in conversation months ago, calling him the guy who's always mansplaining. It hadn't stood out at the time, but now, it hit like a brick. Was this the same Mark? The one she claimed to barely tolerate at work? If so, she was a better liar than I'd ever imagined. Then came the break I wasn't expecting. One evening, Emily was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I normally wouldn't dare touch her phone, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a text from M with a heart emoji next to the name. "Can't wait to see you this weekend. Hope James doesn't suspect anything." My blood boiled. I couldn't bring myself to read more, not yet. I snapped a photo of the screen with my own phone and put hers back exactly where I found it. She came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, all smiles like nothing was wrong. "Everything okay?" she asked, drying her hair with a towel. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady, though I felt like screaming. "Just going over some flight schedules." That night, I barely slept. The text kept replaying in my mind. Mark wasn't just a fling. He was a regular fixture in her life. They had a system, a whole operation designed to keep me in the dark. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I arranged for an unexpected day off from work. Emily thought I was flying to San Francisco, but I stayed back, parking my car a block away from the house. Around 7 p.m., her car pulled into the driveway. She went inside. Then, not 20 minutes later, another car pulled up, a sleek black sedan. Out stepped Mark, looking every bit as smug as I imagined. He rang the doorbell, and Emily answered in a sundress I hadn't seen her wear in years. She hugged him like they were in some cheesy romance movie. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every instinct told me to storm in and confront them, but I held back. I needed a plan. I took photos of them through the living room window, laughing, drinking wine, her leaning on his shoulder. My chest burned with anger, but I couldn't let emotions take over. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about making sure I came out of this mess with my dignity, and if possible, the upper hand. As I drove away that night, my mind spun with possibilities. How far had this gone? Was it just Mark, or were there others? And most importantly, how could I confront Emily in a way that left no room for her lies? The storm wasn't just here. It was about to hit full force. The drive home was a blur. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I replayed the evening in my mind. Emily and Mark, laughing together like they didn't have a care in the world, while I sat outside in the shadows like a stranger in my own life. But I wasn't going to sit back anymore. I spent the next few days carefully planning my next steps. I didn't want a messy confrontation where she could wriggle out with excuses or deflections. No, I needed to hit her with undeniable proof. Something so solid that even her most creative lies couldn't twist it. I started with the photos. They weren't enough on their own, just a couple of blurry shots through the window. But they were a start. I needed more. So, I decided to follow her. Emily had mentioned another girls' night coming up. I knew better now than to believe her stories at face value. I pretended to have a flight scheduled for the same evening, conveniently mentioning that I'd be gone overnight. She didn't even flinch, just nodded and said, "Okay, have a safe trip." Her calmness only fueled my determination. That evening, instead of heading to the airport, I parked down the street from our house, hidden behind a row of hedges. I waited. Around 8 p.m., her car pulled out of the driveway. She was dressed up, her makeup flawless, wearing a dress I hadn't seen in years. My heart twisted at the sight. This wasn't how she dressed for me anymore. I followed her car at a safe distance. She drove downtown and pulled into the parking garage of a trendy hotel. I parked nearby and watched as she stepped out of the car and walked into the building. 5 minutes later, Mark showed up. I clenched the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. They didn't even bother pretending this was innocent. He greeted her with a kiss in the hotel lobby before they disappeared into the elevator together. I stayed long enough to confirm which room they entered, then called the hotel. Posing as Mark, I told the front desk I'd forgotten the room number I'd booked. The clerk cheerfully gave it to me without hesitation. Room 1203. By now, my anger was a full-blown inferno. But again, I knew better than to act impulsively. I left the hotel and called a friend, Greg, who worked as a private investigator. He owed me a favor after I'd helped him get a discount on a flight for his honeymoon. I explained the situation, and within hours, he had surveillance equipment set up in the room. I went home that night feeling like a different man, determined, angry, but strangely focused. The next day, Greg sent me the footage. My stomach churned as I watched Emily and Mark together, laughing, holding hands, sharing moments that were supposed to belong to us. And that wasn't the worst part. Between their whispered conversations and fleeting touches, I overheard them talking about me. "He's so clueless," Emily said with a smirk. "He never asks questions anymore. I can tell he's totally checked out." Mark chuckled. "Good. Makes things easier for us. As long as he keeps flying off to play Captain Sky, we've got nothing to worry about." My chest felt like it was caving in. The betrayal was bad enough, but the mockery? That cut deeper than I thought possible. But now I had everything I needed. Photos, footage, and proof of their little affair. It was time to bring the storm to them that I didn't sleep much after getting the footage. Every second of that video burned into my mind. Each laugh and touch seared like a brand. I felt like a fool, a husband unknowingly playing the part of a punchline in their private joke. But that was about to change. The following evening, Emily was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone like it was just another ordinary day. My heart pounded as I sat across from her at the dining table, the evidence ready and waiting on my laptop. "Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, She glanced up, her expression neutral. Yeah, we need to talk. Those words must have triggered something in her, because she immediately stiffened. About what? I tilted my head, studying her carefully. About where you've been going when I'm away. About Mark? Her phone slipped slightly in her hand before she caught it. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. What are you talking about? Don't, I said, my voice firmer now. Don't insult me by pretending. I know everything, Emily. The hotel, the lies, the texts. I even know about the little jokes you and Mark share at my expense. Her jaw tightened, and she folded her arms. You've been spying on me? I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. Spying? Don't try to turn this around. You've been cheating, lying, and laughing behind my back, and you're worried about me spying? She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You don't understand. It's not what you think. Stop. I slammed my hand on the table, the sound echoing in the room. It's exactly what I think. I have proof, Emily. Pictures, videos, conversations. So don't stand there and try to lie your way out of this. For the first time, her composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I was lonely, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're never here, James. You're always flying off to some other part of the world, and I'm stuck here alone, feeling invisible. And that justifies this? I shot back, pointing at the laptop. This is how you handle feeling lonely? By bringing someone else into my house? Into my bed? Her tears spilled over as she sat back down. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said softly, almost pathetically. It just did. I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words, but refusing to let them crush me. You didn't mean for it to happen? Emily, affairs don't just happen. You made choices. Repeatedly. You lied to my face over and over again. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing now. I'm sorry, James. I don't know what to say. I messed up. I don't even know who I am anymore. For a moment, I just stared at her, unsure if I felt anything at all. The woman I had loved for years, the one I had proposed to under a Parisian sky, was now a stranger to me. Who you are? I said finally, my voice cold. You're someone who destroyed everything we built together. You're someone who traded loyalty and trust for cheap thrills with a guy who doesn't give a damn about you. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. That's not true. Mark cares about me. Don't. I cut her off, my voice sharp. Don't even say his name to me. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the gears grinding as she tried to think of something, anything, that could salvage this mess. But there was no going back. I'll pack my things, she said quietly, finally breaking the silence. No, I replied, standing up. I will decide what happens next. You've done enough damage, Emily. Don't think for 1 second that you get to walk away on your terms. Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, defeated. I walked out of the room, needing air, needing space, needing something to make sense of the chaos. As I stepped outside, the cool night breeze hit me, but it didn't soothe the fire raging inside. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After confronting Emily, the anger inside me didn't fade. It shifted. It had a new target, Mark, the man who dared to walk into my home, sit on my couch, and steal what wasn't his to take. The next morning, I woke early, feeling a grim determination. I wasn't about to let Mark think he could get away with this without facing me. Emily stayed in the guest room that night, and I hadn't spoken to her since the confrontation. She could wait. Right now, I needed answers from him. I called his office around 9 a.m., pretending to be a client interested in a marketing consultation. His assistant was all too happy to set up a meeting for later that day. Perfect. When I walked in his office hours later, my fists were clenched so tightly I thought my knuckles might split. He was seated at his desk, looking every bit the smug, confident type I'd come to despise. He didn't recognize me at first, greeting me with a friendly smile as he stood to shake my hand. Mark, right? I asked, forcing an air of calm I didn't feel. That's me, he replied, oblivious. And you are? I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer, my eyes boring into his. It took a moment, but I saw the exact second he realized who I was. The color drained from his face, and his outstretched hand froze midair. "Oh," he stammered, his voice faltering. "James." I smiled coldly, stepping into his office and shutting the door behind me. "Glad you remember me. Saves us an awkward introduction." He swallowed hard, glancing toward the door as if considering an escape. "Look, I can explain." "Explain what?" I shot back, my voice icy. "How you been sneaking into my house? Sleeping with my wife? Laughing at me behind my back? Go ahead. I'd love to hear this explanation." Mark's confidence crumbled under my glare. He stammered, searching for words, but I wasn't interested in his excuses. "You know," I continued, pacing slowly around his office, "I trusted Emily. I trusted her. But you're something else. You looked me in the eye when I dropped her off at those work events. You probably shook my hand at some point, didn't you?" He nodded mutely, his guilt painted across his face. "And all the while, you were planning this," I said, my voice rising. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Sneaking around, texting her while I was flying halfway across the world. Did you feel proud of yourself? Did it feel good, Mark? Taking something that wasn't yours?" "James, listen," he finally managed, holding up his hands. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't mean for it to go this far? Is that what you tell yourself, so you can sleep at night?" Mark tried to explain himself, throwing out half-baked excuses about how they connected and how he didn't want to hurt me. But I wasn't interested in his justifications. "I don't care about your reasons," I snapped. "What I care about is what happens next. You've already destroyed my marriage. You've already ruined whatever trust one had in the people closest to me. But you're not walking away from this unscathed." "What do you mean?" he asked nervously. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a menacing calm. "You've got a choice. You tell Emily it's over. No contact. No lingering texts, no one last meeting. You cut ties completely. Or I take every piece of evidence I have, photos, videos, texts, and make sure your wife, your boss, and anyone who will listen know exactly what kind of person you are." Mark's eyes widened. "You wouldn't. Try me," I said flatly. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands. "Fine," he muttered. "It's over. I'll tell her it's done." "Good," I said, turning to leave. But before I opened the door, I glanced back. "And Mark, if I so much as see your car near my house again, you'll regret it." As I walked out of his office, I felt a surge of bitter satisfaction. It wasn't a win, not really. Nothing could erase the damage he and Emily had done. But at least I'd made him face me. At least I'd made him understand that his actions had consequences. This wasn't over yet. Emily and I still had to figure out what came next. The confrontation with Mark left me feeling drained, not triumphant. Sure, I'd made my point, but it hadn't erased the betrayal or filled the gaping hole left in my chest. When I got home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. Emily was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the coffee table. Her hair was tied up, and she wore one of my old sweatshirts, something she hadn't done in years. The sight of her like that almost softened me. Almost. "James," she started as I walked in, her voice hesitant. "We need to talk." I sighed, tossing my keys onto the counter. "I think we've done enough talking, don't you?" "No," she said, standing up. "Not like this. Please, just hear me out." I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "Fine, talk." She wrung her hands, struggling to find the words. "I know I messed up. I know I betrayed your trust in the worst way possible. But I need you to understand that it wasn't about you. It wasn't because you weren't enough." I raised an eyebrow, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Then what was it about, Emily? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you made a choice to destroy everything we built." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time I didn't feel the need to comfort her. "I felt lost," she said softly. "You were gone so much, and I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Mark, he made me feel seen, like I wasn't just some pilot's wife waiting at home for scraps of attention." Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay composed. "So, instead of talking to me about how you felt, You decided to have an affair? Great solution, Emily. Really top-notch problem-solving. She flinched at my sarcasm, but pressed on. I know I went about it the wrong way. I know I hurt you. But I need you to know that I still love you. I never stopped loving you, James. I let out a bitter laugh. You've got a funny way of showing it. I mean it, she said, stepping closer. What happened with Mark, it's over. I told him today. I told him I don't want anything to do with him anymore. That caught me off guard. You spoke to him? She nodded. I ended it. For good. And I meant it. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I believed her. She'd lied so many times before. What made this time any different? I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said, her voice breaking. I know I don't deserve that, but I'm begging you not to give up on us. Please, James. Let me make this right. Her desperation was palpable, and it left me conflicted. A part of me wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could somehow salvage the ruins of our marriage. But another part of me, the part that had seen the video of her laughing with Mark, wasn't so sure. How am I supposed to trust you again? I asked, my voice heavy with exhaustion. You've lied to me, Emily, over and over again. How do I know you're not just saying what you think I want to hear? She wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I'll be an open book. No more secrets, no more lies. Just please don't give up on us. I stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. She looked broken, genuinely remorseful. But was that enough? Could I really let go of the betrayal and start over? I need time, I said finally. I can't make any promises, Emily. Not right now. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, a shadow of the woman I thought I knew. As I climbed into bed that night, my mind was a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, and somewhere deep down a glimmer of hope. Could we rebuild what we'd lost? Or was it already too late? The days that followed felt like walking through a fog. Emily kept her distance, giving me space while still making small gestures, offering coffee in the mornings, making dinner, tidying the house. It was almost as if she thought normalcy could erase what she'd done. But I wasn't ready to play along. I spent most of my time out of the house, either flying or at the gym, trying to clear my head. Every time I looked at her, I saw her with Mark. Her laugh, her touch. They weren't mine anymore, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. One evening, as I sat in my car outside our driveway, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Whether it was for closure or clarity, I needed to take action. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a marriage counselor. I didn't tell Emily right away. I wasn't even sure if I wanted her to come. But as I stared at the confirmation email, I realized I didn't want to navigate this alone. That evening, after dinner, I finally broke the silence. I made an appointment, I said, setting my glass down on the table. Emily looked up from her plate, confused. For what? Marriage counseling, I replied. Her eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through her guarded expression. You mean you want to try? I don't know, I admitted. But I want to at least figure out what's next. Whether that's fixing this mess or walking away. I don't know yet. She nodded quickly, her voice soft. Thank you. I'll go. I'll do whatever it takes. The first session was awkward, to say the least. The counselor, Dr. Harris, was calm and methodical, asking questions that felt like needles poking at raw wounds. Emily cried when she recounted her version of events, explaining how she felt isolated and neglected while I was away. I stayed silent through most of the session, arms crossed, jaw tight. When Dr. Harris finally turned to me, I let it all out, the anger, the betrayal, the humiliation. Emily sat quietly, wiping at her tears, but not interrupting. By the end of the session, I wasn't sure if we'd made progress or just reopened old wounds. The following sessions weren't much easier, but I could see Emily trying. She was transparent about her actions, admitting fault without making excuses. She even went so far as to hand over all her passwords, saying, I want to rebuild trust, no matter how long it takes. Still, my walls were up. Every time I saw a notification pop up on her phone, my stomach churned, even if it was just her sister texting. One night, during a particularly heavy session, Dr. Harris asked the question I'd been avoiding. James, do you want to stay in this marriage? Not for Emily. Not for the history. For you. The room fell silent. Emily stared at me, her eyes wide and glistening. I don't know, I said after a long pause. I love the idea of what we had. I love what we built. But right now, I don't know if I can ever trust her again. Emily looked down, her face crumpling. But she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, as if she knew the damage might be too great to repair. The session ended on a somber note, and as we drove home, the silence between us was deafening. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The memories of our happy moments, the love we once shared, they all felt like ghosts haunting me. I wanted to believe that we could find our way back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been shattered. Was love enough to bridge the gap? Or was this the beginning of the end? The days stretched into weeks, each one feeling heavier than the last. The counseling sessions continued, but for every step forward, there were 2 steps back. Trust wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. And while Emily seemed committed to mending things, I couldn't silence the voice in my head whispering that it was all too little, too late. One night, I decided to test her sincerity. Emily, I said as we sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background. I've been thinking about something. She looked up from her tea, her face weary but hopeful. What is it? I want us to separate for a while, I said, the words tasting foreign in my mouth. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't respond. Separate? James, I thought we were trying to fix this. We are, I said, keeping my voice steady. But I can't think clearly while we're under the same roof. I need space to figure out what I want, what we want. Her lip quivered, but she nodded. If that's what you need, then okay. I'll go stay with my parents. Her compliance surprised me. No argument, no resistance, just quiet acceptance. It was almost unsettling, like she'd been bracing herself for this moment. The next morning, she packed a few bags and left. The house felt unbearably quiet after she was gone, the emptiness echoing in every room. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I spent the next few days focusing on myself. I threw myself into my workouts, picked up extra shifts, and even reconnected with old friends. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel like me again. Not the betrayed husband or the pilot running on autopilot, but James, a man with his own identity. But the space didn't silence my doubts. If anything, it magnified them. One evening, as I scrolled through old photos on my phone, I stumbled upon a picture of Emily and me from our honeymoon in Italy. We were standing on a cliffside in Positano, her head resting on my shoulder, both of us laughing at something I couldn't remember. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile that image of us with the people we had become. How had we fallen so far? Could we ever get back to that place? A text from Emily interrupted my thoughts. Emily, I just wanted to say I miss you. And I'm sorry. For everything. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her I missed her too. But another part of me, the part still holding on to the betrayal, couldn't. Instead, I set the phone down and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The following week, during another counseling session, Dr. Harris brought up the separation. How has it been for you, James? She asked. I hesitated, glancing at Emily, who looked down at her hands. It's been clarifying, I said finally. I've had time to think, to focus on myself. And what have you realized? Dr. Harris pressed. I took a deep breath, the weight of my thoughts pressing against my chest. I've realized that I can't keep living in the past. I have to make a choice. Either forgive her and move forward, or let her go. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes brimming with tears. James, please, she said, her voice cracking. I know I've hurt you, but I love you. I'm not giving up on us. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I fell in love with. But was love enough? I need more time, I said, my voice heavy. I'm not ready to make a decision yet. Dr. Harris nodded, her expression neutral. That's okay, James. Healing isn't linear. Take the time you need. Emily wiped at her tears, nodding silently. But as I sat there, the weight of the situation pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The days stretched on, and the separation settled into an uneasy routine. Emily stayed with her parents, texting me occasionally with updates or small messages like, "I'm thinking about you." I responded sparingly, trying to keep a balance between politeness and distance. One evening, I found myself going through an old box of mementos we'd tucked away in the basement. It was filled with scraps of our life together, movie tickets from our first date, postcards from our travels, and a stack of anniversary cards we'd exchanged over the years. At the bottom of the box was a framed photo of us from our wedding day. Emily was radiant, her smile wide and genuine as she leaned into me. I remembered how nervous I'd been that day, worried that the life I'd built wasn't enough for someone as vibrant as her. Looking at the photo now, I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with bitterness. That man in the photo had no idea what was coming. But then again, neither had Emily. It was easy to forget that there were moments in our marriage when I'd fallen short too. Times when I'd chosen work over us. When I'd ignored her quiet pleas for connection because I was too focused on my own responsibilities. Had those moments planted the seeds of our downfall? Or was I just trying to justify her betrayal? The next morning, I decided to visit her parents' house. I hadn't planned on seeing her, but her father had always been kind to me, and I needed a neutral space to talk. When I arrived, Emily's dad greeted me with a warm, if slightly cautious, smile. "James," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "It's good to see you." "You too," I replied, meaning it. We sat in the living room, sipping coffee and talking about the usual things: work, the weather, his retirement plans. But eventually, the conversation drifted to Emily. "She's been quiet lately," he said, carefully choosing his words. "I know she messed up, and I know you have every right to be angry. But she's trying, James. She really is." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "I don't know if that counts for anything," he added, setting his mug down. "But I thought you should know." As I left their house, I found myself parked in the driveway for longer than I intended. A part of me wanted to knock on the door and ask Emily to talk. Another part told me to drive away and leave the past behind. Instead, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through her texts. "Emily, I hope you're doing okay. I miss you more than I can say." The words lingered on the screen, waiting for a response. I started typing, then deleted the message, then typed again. Finally, I sent a simple reply. "Me, I don't know what I'm feeling right now, but I think we need to talk." Her response came almost immediately. "Emily, anytime, anywhere. Just say the word." Later that evening, we met at a quiet park we used to visit during the early days of our relationship. The setting was almost painfully familiar. The same bench, the same view of the lake reflecting the fading sunlight. Emily arrived a few minutes later, her hair tied back and her expression cautious but hopeful. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly. "You know det, I've been doing a lot of thinking." I began, my voice steady but strained. "So have I," she said quickly, then hesitated. "James, I know I've said this 100 times, but I'm so sorry. I was selfish, and I didn't see what I had until I destroyed it." I studied her face, searching for cracks in her sincerity, but finding none. "I've been thinking about us," I said, my words slow and deliberate. "About how we got here. And I realize it wasn't just you, Emily. I failed too. I put my career first and let the distance grow between us." She blinked, tears brimming in her eyes. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't. But if we're going to try to fix this, we can't keep pretending the fault was all on one side." Her lip quivered, and she nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes, James. I mean that. I don't want to lose us." I looked out at the lake, the silence stretching between us. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise right now." Her breath hitched, and she reached out, hesitating before placing her hand lightly on mine. "That's all I need." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, uncertainty, and the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. The weeks following that meeting at the park were tentative, like walking on a frozen lake and listening for cracks. Emily moved back into the house, but things were different. She stayed in the guest room, and we barely interacted except for counseling sessions and the occasional shared meal. It was awkward, but I needed boundaries. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Counseling helped, but it was exhausting. Dr. Harris pushed us to be brutally honest, and some of those conversations were more painful than anything I'd imagined. One session stands out in my mind. "Emily," Dr. Harris asked, her voice calm but firm, "if James had done what you did, cheated, lied, would you be able to forgive him?" Emily looked down at her hands, the weight of the question visibly crushing her. "I don't know," she admitted softly. I think I'd be angry. Hurt. Maybe I want to walk away." "That's fair," Dr. Harris said. "But it's important to understand what you're asking James to do. Forgiveness isn't a guarantee. It's a choice, and it's one of the hardest choices he'll ever have to make." I stayed quiet, staring at the floor. She was right. Forgiving Emily wasn't just about moving past what she'd done. It was about risking my heart again, knowing full well it could be shattered all over. That night, Emily broke the silence as we sat across from each other at dinner. "I know I've said this 100 times," she began hesitantly, "but I need to say it again. I am sorry, James, for everything, for what I did, for how I hurt you, for betraying your trust." I set my fork down, meeting her gaze. "I hear you, Emily. I do. But words aren't enough. I need actions. Consistency. Time." "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." And to her credit, she did start showing it. She deleted Mark's contact info in front of me, even going as far as blocking him on every platform. She gave me access to her phone, her email, her entire digital life. While it felt invasive to check, the openness mattered. She also started making small, thoughtful gestures. She'd leave a note in my flight bag, saying something like, "Have a great flight. I miss you." She planned dinners when I was home. Nothing extravagant, just quiet meals where we could talk, or sit in silence without the weight of tension crushing us. I could see she was trying, and that made me feel something I hadn't expected: guilt. I hadn't been innocent in all of this. Sure, I didn't cheat, but I'd neglected her emotionally. I'd spent years prioritizing my career, assuming our love would survive on autopilot. It hadn't. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I finally admitted it. "I haven't been a great husband," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Emily looked up from her book, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. "What do you mean?" I mean, I haven't been present," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I've been so focused on work, on providing, that I forgot how to be with you. I didn't notice when you started pulling away because I wasn't looking." She set the book down, her eyes soft. "That doesn't make what I did okay." "No, it doesn't," I agreed. "But I can't sit here and act like I didn't contribute to the distance between us." The conversation lingered in the air long after we stopped talking, but for the first time in a while I felt like we were on the same page. The real turning point came during one of my flights. I was flying a route to Chicago, a relatively short trip, and as I glanced at the horizon, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not the Emily who had betrayed me, but the Emily I fell in love with. The woman who made me laugh, who shared her dreams with me, who once wrote "You're my favorite adventure" on a napkin and left it in my pocket before a flight. I missed that Emily. When I got home, I found her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up, startled when she saw me. "You're back early," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down. "Listen, I've been thinking." Her expression shifted, cautious. "About what?" "About us," I said, stepping closer. "About what we had, and maybe what we could have again." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything, just nodded. "It's not a promise," I said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not saying everything's fixed, but I'm saying I'm willing to try. For real this time." Emily's tears spilled over as she reached for me, wrapping her arms around my waist. I stood stiffly for a moment before relaxing, letting her hold me. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Not for the past we'd lost, but for the future we might still build. That flicker of hope was fragile, like a match struck in the wind. Still, it was there, and I knew I had to nurture it if we had any chance of moving forward. The next few weeks were a cautious dance, Emily and I trying to figure out how to rebuild something that felt irreparably broken. Counseling became less about pointing fingers and more about rediscovering who we were as individuals. Dr. Harris challenged us to remember what we loved about each other in the first place. At first, the exercise felt awkward, forced even. "James," Dr. Harris asked during one session, "what drew you to Emily when you first met her?" I glanced at Emily, who looked nervous but curious. The memories came rushing back. Her laugh, her wit, the way she lit up a room without trying. She had this spark, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. Like she was the center of her own universe, and somehow I got lucky enough to be part of it. Emily blinked, clearly trying not to cry. "I never knew you felt that way," she said softly. "I did, I admitted. I still do sometimes, but it's buried under a lot of hurt right now." Dr. Harris nodded, her calm presence guiding the conversation. "Emily, what about you? What made you fall for James?" Emily hesitated, fiddling with her hands. "He made me feel safe," she said finally. "Not just physically, but emotionally. Like no matter what happened, he'd always be there to catch me." Hearing those words stung, knowing I hadn't been that for her in years. But it also reminded me that at one point, we were us. The exercises didn't magically fix everything, but they opened the door to conversations we hadn't had in years. We started spending intentional time together. No phones, no distractions. Just us. One evening, I suggested we cook dinner together. It felt symbolic, in a way, to build something together, even if it was just a simple meal. As we chopped vegetables side by side, Emily turned to me with a hesitant smile. "Do you remember the first meal we cooked together?" I laughed, the memory surfacing immediately. "How could I forget? You burned the garlic so badly the smoke alarm went off." She grinned, her cheeks flushing. "I was trying to impress you, and I was too polite to tell you the pasta tasted like charcoal," I teased. For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed together, real, genuine laughter. After dinner, we sat on the couch, sipping wine and reminiscing about the early days of our relationship. It felt like a glimpse of the couple we used to be, before life and betrayal turned us into strangers. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The wounds were still fresh, and there were moments when doubt crept in, threatening to undo the progress we'd made. I'd catch myself second-guessing her every move, wondering if she was truly committed or if this was all just another layer of the lie. Emily noticed. "James," she said one night, her voice trembling, "I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, and I know it's going to take time for you to trust me again. But I need you to tell me when you're feeling like this. Don't keep it bottled up." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. I nodded slowly. "I'm trying, Emily. It's just hard. I want to believe you. I really do. But sometimes it feels like there's this wall I can't get past." "Then we'll chip away at it," she said, reaching for my hand. "Brick by brick, if we have to." Her words stayed with me. We continued making small steps, sharing more about our days, revisiting old traditions like Sunday morning pancakes, and taking long walks where we could talk without distractions. One day, while cleaning out the garage, I stumbled across an old shoebox filled with letters we'd written to each other during our long-distance phase. I sat down on the cold concrete floor and started reading, my chest tightening with every word. The letters were raw, filled with promises of forever and dreams we'd shared. They reminded me of the depth of our connection before life pulled us in different directions. That evening, I handed the box to Emily. "Read these," I said. "They're a reminder of what we used to be." She spent hours going through them, her eyes red from crying by the time she finished. "We were so in love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We were," I agreed, "and I want to believe we can be again." Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. "So do I, James. More than anything." It wasn't a declaration of victory. It wasn't even a guarantee. But it was a start. As Emily and I continued trying to rebuild our marriage, I started noticing something unexpected. A part of me didn't want to heal too quickly. It was like holding on to the anger and pain gave me a sense of control, a way to protect myself from being hurt again. But that mindset wasn't sustainable, and it came to a head one night during counseling. Dr. Harris leaned forward, her gaze steady. "James, you've made progress in opening up, but there's something holding you back. What is it?" I hesitated, glancing at Emily. Her face was a mixture of curiosity and dread, as though she was bracing herself for the worst. "I'm afraid," I admitted finally. "I'm afraid that if I let go of the anger, I'll forget what happened. That if I forgive her, it'll somehow mean the betrayal didn't matter." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed quiet, letting me speak. "And what if it happens again?" I continued, my voice rising. "What if I let my guard down, and I'm blindsided all over again? I don't think I could survive that." Dr. Harris nodded, her expression empathetic. "Those fears are valid, James. Forgiveness doesn't erase the pain or the betrayal. It's not about saying what happened was okay. It's about choosing not to let it control your life anymore." Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I know I don't have the right to ask you to forgive me, but I swear, James, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worth it. I'll do whatever it takes." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something close to relief. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about acknowledging the hurt and choosing to move forward despite it. That night, after we got home, Emily approached me in the kitchen. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "About how you're afraid to let go of the anger." I turned to face her, unsure where she was going with this. "I want to do something," she continued. "Something that shows I'm serious about earning your trust back." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I want to call Mark. In front of you. I want you to hear me tell him it's over for good." The offer caught me completely off guard. "You don't have to." "No," she interrupted firmly. "You do. You deserve to hear it." I nodded slowly, gesturing for her to go ahead. She dialed the number, her hands shaking slightly. When Mark picked up, his voice was smooth, almost smug. "Emily," he said, dragging out her name like a snake coiling around prey. Her jaw tightened. "This is the last time you'll ever hear from me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Whatever we had, whatever I thought this was, it's over. I'm choosing my husband. Don't contact me again." Mark chuckled, his tone laced with condescension. "You sure about that? Thought we had something special." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "We didn't. Goodbye, Mark." She hung up before he could say another word and set the phone down with a shaky exhale. I didn't know what to say. The gesture was bold, almost defiant, but it was also raw and vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. "Thank you," I said finally. She nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "I meant what I said. I'm choosing you, James. Every day, I'll choose you." The word struck something deep within me. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. That night, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the call in my mind. It wasn't just about Mark. It was about Emily taking responsibility for her actions and committing to change. Maybe we really could find our way back to each other, that Emily's call to Mark was a turning point, but it didn't magically fix everything. The scars of her betrayal still lingered, and rebuilding trust felt like assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. We began spending more intentional time together, cautiously testing the waters of what a future together might look like. It started small, going for walks, sharing meals, talking about lighthearted topics that didn't dredge up the past. One weekend, Emily suggested we take a day trip to Estes Park, a place we used to visit often during our early years together. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to share something so sentimental with her again. But eventually, I agreed. The drive up was quiet, but not tense. Emily seemed nervous, like she was afraid to say the wrong thing. I tried to focus on the scenery, the winding roads, the golden aspens swaying in the breeze. But my mind kept drifting to her. When we arrived, we headed to one of our favorite hiking trails. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine trees was oddly comforting. As we walked, Emily started talking about memories we'd shared there. The time I'd slipped on ice and nearly tumbled into a creek, the picnic where a raccoon had stolen her sandwich. For the first time in a long while, I found myself laughing with her. At one point, we reached a rocky overlook that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. We stood there in silence for a while, the wind brushing against our faces. "It's beautiful," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I replied, my voice distant. She turned to me, her expression serious. "Thank you for coming here with me. I know it's not easy letting me back in, but it means a lot." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The truth was, I still wasn't certain if I was letting her back in or simply testing how far I could go without breaking. Later, as we drove home, Emily reached for my hand. It was a tentative gesture, and for a moment I considered pulling away. But instead, I let her fingers intertwine with mine. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself reflecting on the day. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I was making the right choice. But there were also moments of connection, fleeting but real, that reminded me of why I fell in love with her in the first place. A new challenge. The next week, something unexpected happened. I was at work preparing for a flight when I received a text from Emily. "Can we talk tonight? There's something I need to tell you." My stomach dropped. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had she lied about ending things with Mark? Was there something else she'd been hiding? When I got home that evening, Emily was waiting for me in the living room. She looked anxious, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What's going on?" I asked, setting my bag down. She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about how I can show you I'm serious about fixing this. And I realized I need to go back to therapy. On my own." I blinked, caught off guard. "Therapy?" She nodded. "I've been working on our marriage, but I haven't been working on myself. I need to understand why I did what I did, how I let things get so far. Because if I don't fix that part of me, I'll never be able to truly fix us." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. It was a gesture I hadn't expected, a willingness to take accountability in a way that went beyond just our relationship. "Okay," I said finally. "If that's what you need to do, I support it." She smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you, James. I promise, I'm doing this for both of us." As I watched her that night, I felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step closer to believing that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. Emily started therapy the following week, attending sessions twice a week with a therapist she'd found on her own. She didn't share much about what they talked about, but the small changes in her demeanor spoke volumes. She was more patient, more reflective, and when we did argue, which still happened occasionally, she didn't immediately become defensive. Meanwhile, I continued my own journey, trying to reconcile my anger and pain with the glimpses of the woman I fell in love with still shining through. One evening, about a month into her therapy, Emily approached me in the living room. "James," she said, her voice steady but nervous, "I want to share something with you." I set down the book I was pretending to read. "Okay." She sat across from me, hands folded tightly in her lap. "In therapy, I've been working through a lot. My insecurities, my selfishness, my inability to ask for help when I'm struggling. And I realized something." I leaned forward, listening intently. "I let myself believe that I wasn't good enough for you," she continued. "You're so accomplished, so driven, and I felt like I was just standing still. Instead of talking to you about those feelings, I looked for validation somewhere else. It was wrong. So wrong. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her voice cracked, but she held herself together. "But I want you to know something. I'm not asking you to stay with me because of our history or because of guilt. I want you to stay with me because you believe in the person I'm trying to become, the person I should have been all along." Her words were raw, unpolished, and they hit me harder than I expected. I sat there for a long time, processing what she'd said. She didn't push me for a response, just waited patiently, her eyes searching mine. Finally, I spoke. "I've been thinking a lot too," I said slowly. "About us. About what we've been through and what's ahead. And I realized something." Emily's breath hitched, but she stayed silent. "I can't keep living with one foot out the door," I said, meeting her gaze. "If we're going to make this work, I have to be all in. That means forgiveness. Not for your sake, But for mine, it means giving us a real chance, not just going through the motions. Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, a small, hopeful smile that lit up her face. James, does that mean? It means I'm choosing us, I said, my voice firm. I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we were, but I want to try, really try. The relief on her face was palpable as she reached for my hand. I let her take it, her fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with mine. I promise you, she said, her voice breaking. I won't let you down again. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right. That night, as we sat together on the couch, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift, just a little. There was still work to be done, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were walking it together. And that was enough. Reflection. It's been a year since that night, and while our marriage isn't perfect, it's stronger than it's ever been. Therapy helped both of us confront our flaws and learn how to communicate in ways we never had before. There are still moments when the memories creep in, when the hurt resurfaces, but they don't define us anymore. We've learned to face those moments together, to lean on each other instead of pulling away. If I've learned anything from this experience, it's that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing to move forward despite the pain. It's about rebuilding one small act of trust at a time. For anyone out there going through something similar, know this: it's okay to feel broken. It's okay to take your time, and it's okay to walk away if that's what you need. But if you choose to stay, choose to heal, choose to fight for something better, you might just find that love, even after betrayal, can still be worth it.